Hi, y'all. So, I'm gonna fix you for a little bit. There we go. It's a camera. Um, that's good enough. Okay, I hope y'all are doing well. This week we are discussing global stratification and just stratification in general. Um, so I think it's a chapter on global stratification that you should be reading this week. I also selected a documentary, free on YouTube from PBS, called Poor Kids, that you have to read for your discussion, as well as a reading from one of your textbooks, that I decided to select. Um, because I'm not really in this sort of lecture, I'm kind of dancing around certain terms like class, and certain different types of class, like upper class, lower class, middle class. I don't have a formal lecture on that necessarily, and how a class forms, how groups form necessarily, but this is kind of getting at a lot of that within the realm of stratification because the terms class, upper class, lower class signify how people are stratified within a given society. And so, by having an upper class system, a lower class system, a middle class system, that signifies that a society is stratified through different class systems. That's the common one that we see, for example, in the United States is upper class, lower class, middle class. But that's not the only class system. Um, but that's essentially what I'll be getting into, with this lecture video. This is also a hefty one. I have to apologize, but there's a lot of information here. Textbook discusses poverty, which poverty in and of itself is something that cannot be discussed within 50 minutes. And I'm just going to have to skim through a lot of different information because there's a long history there and understanding what poverty is and how we have approached poverty historically speaking, from the United States to Europe and the like here. Um, so again, if you are looking for more information on poverty and the like, I've posted some videos, um, on the specific topic. And I can always post some more resources or provide more resources, because I have them. So getting into it, I'm going to start sharing my screen. Okay, so I'm gonna move me right there, I think. Okay, so. And if you want more information on social class and the like and how class systems form, I think the chapter before this one discusses that. It's a very brief chapter, on social class. And so if you're really curious, you can read that. But getting into it, social stratification is the division of large numbers of people into layers according to the relative property, power, and prestige. Um, I really like the fact that this definition has the word layers here because it really, really helps you to visualize what stratification might look like. What's also important about this definition is the three P's: property, power, and prestige. Something that, Karl Marx talks about, something that major sociologists talk about and highlight. And so, this also applies to social stratification here, applies to nations, peoples, societies, and groups. And even within small groups, we tend to see a separation of power or a display of power within specific groups. The same thing that we see in bigger sort of populations like societies and like nations, right? We tend to see that splitting of property, power, and prestige within these types of groups, regardless of whether or not they're big or small here. Key components of social stratification, as discussed in your textbook, are social categories here. Social categories being gender, class, race, ethnicity, any identifiers like disabilities, diseases, the like here would also fall within social categories, as well as neurotypical, atypical, the like here. Certain terms that we have applied to certain things, right, within our society would count as social categories, how people categorize themselves. Um, Two, unequal distribution of resources. Resources being not just money here, resources being social networking, being able to connect with people, job retention, where you live, what you own, tangible items that you might own counts as resources here, as well as, I did discuss this in cultural anthropology, but as well as resources being food, right? Resources being your property, crops, land, anything of the like could be categorized as resources here. Then intergenerational persistence. The persistence of social stratification and the continuation of it, where we see it become a part of society and culture, where it's normalized, where we tend to, why do we have upper class, lower class, and middle class? Why don't we just have a single class system? Why keep the same system for so long? What would it look like if we remove the aspect of an upper class and a lower class and middle class? What would that exactly look like? And why do we keep something like that in continuation, right? And so that also interweaves with our culture, right? And our culture continuing that aspect as well. Okay, so there are where can I move this that's not in the way? This is slightly not in the way. There are four major systems of social stratification here. You have slavery, caste, estate, class. Did I name them all? Yes, I named them all. So slavery is a form of social stratification in which some people own other people. Slavery has been practiced in the United States as well as other nations and countries here for centuries. It's something that was legalized at one point in time and was part of our culture, in other words. It was something that was viewed as acceptable in many ways. Then you have the caste system. The caste system is a form of social stratification in which people's statuses are lifelong conditions determined by birth. And caste system is more rigid than something like a class system. What I mean by that is when you live in a class system, like upper class, lower class, and middle class, you can have upward and downward mobility. You are able to move from being lower class to middle class to maybe upper class, right? Or you're able to also move down that ladder, right? You can go from being upper class to middle class. That's not really the case with caste system here. Caste system is more rigid. It's established at birth, and you can't really change that. And you can't really further change that even through systems like marriage. Class, you can change your class through marrying someone who is upper class or lower class, right? Something that a caste system doesn't allow you to do. Within a caste system, you cannot even marry someone who is outside your caste system, if that makes sense. So, if we look to India's caste system here as an example, a Shudra would not be able to and further would be shunned by society to marry someone who is beyond or upward beyond a Shudra, and wouldn't even be able to marry someone who is a Dalit. Um, and so they keep within their own system, if you will, and they marry people who are similar to that system, because culture determines it and establish it as that system. And so you also have the estate. Uh, this is the stratification system of medieval Europe. This is consisting of three groups. You have the nobility and the nobles, clergymen, clergy, and commoners. Nobility being kings, queens, and the like, clergymen being those who mostly reside in churches that still have an established power within that society, and then commoners. Commoners would be working class people during that time. And then you have the class system. Class system is a form of social stratification based primarily on income, education, and prestige of occupation. And so your income, education, and prestige of occupation, whatever you do for work, stated differently, could really change your class system here, um, especially seen in the United States, where you could seek uh, higher education, you would pay for it, and then that would maybe land you a sustainable job. Maybe, right? That's something that might be promised within a certain region or nation, right? That you would be able to move up the social ladder given these things, like getting a higher income and seeking an education and working within a specific field. Social mobility is something that I've been saying already, is the movement up or down the social ladder. And anything that would affect the social mobility would be education, income, um, status, even your social categories would affect social mobility here. Oh, I have a couple of videos. I might post them to Canvas that are just brief his I like a lot of history, and so these are just brief videos on certain forms of history here, like the slave trade, um, and the to further, help you through certain terms and understanding it and what exactly that means, because we have stratified our society through further layering groups of people and establishing that by the color of their skin, they deserve more within that society. They deserve more power, more prestige, and the like here. And that has been seen and that continues to be seen in certain nations and countries. And so that's just an important historical video. Um, What's further important here are ideologies and what ideologies are kept within a specific society and nation. Ideologies here are beliefs about the ways things ought to be that justify social arrangements. Um, you have the systems of ideas and ideals here, the certain standards that people might have to meet within a given society. And it's kind of an ideology is something that is socialized more often than not within a certain culture and society. It's something that is kind of almost drilled within us from a very young age. And it might be something that we eventually hold dear to us as a specific ideal that we should stand by and uphold, in other words. And this can further form a basis for economic and political theory and policy here. And it might even establish certain laws that we might see within our given country. So, some dominant ideologies, to give you some examples here, would be capitalism, would be patriotism, um, would be marriage and family, and the aspect of marriage and family and getting married and having a family and having babies. That might be a dominant ideology that would be occurring during that time. And so, to further push that ideology, you might see certain policies that lean towards, I don't know, giving money towards families who want to have kids, like the child care credit and the like here, or certain policies that want to support families, or a lack of policies supporting families. That might be seen. And then you also, some ideologies in reference to gender would be patriarchies and matriarchies here. Patriarchies being leaning towards male dominance versus female dominance. This might also further be established within a culture, right? Cultures, historically speaking, haven't just been patriarchal. We have also seen matriarchal cultures where mothers are passed down their property and prestige to their daughters, and that's a continuation of that lineage. So we haven't just seen patriarchy here throughout history, and it's something that is quite interesting when you look at that history. But those are some common ideologies. I'm sure you can come up with some other ones here. Apartheid is another important element within history to note and be aware of, especially in reference to how we socially stratify groups of people and what that is has exactly looked like in connection to something like colonialism. And so, apartheid is the government approved and enforced separation of racial ethnic groups as was practiced in South Africa. Apartheid has not just been seen in South Africa. It's important to note that. Apartheids have been seen from nations to nations, and it is continuing to be seen in specific nations. And so this particular apartheid occurred between 1948 and 1994 in South Africa. 1950, there was a Population Registration Act put into place, and four racial categories were thus created. You had white, colored, Bantu, Black American, and Asian. And so within certain stratified systems, we tend to see a labeling process that might emerge. We saw this in the United States with early, we saw this in the 1950s with the census report establishing that there were only three races. You either were white, black, and then you were white, free, black, free, and it was further establishing race through your status as a slave or not as a slave. And so we've seen this throughout history, this categorization of people by their race. And that's how for a very long time race was defined and established. And if we follow this sort of track here, it doesn't really fit, right? There's not only four racial categories. People are again mixed race here, and they might personally only define as white, or they might personally only define as black here, and it's important to note that as well, that we are complex human beings. Then we also saw Group Areas Act of 1950. This assigns races to townships to keep the races separated. 3.5 million non-whites were removed from their homes and forced to move into segregated neighborhoods. This is also a common theme with apartheids. It's important to note here. And so with something like apartheid, you tend to see historically speaking, a step-by-step process of segregating groups of people by their race in certain areas of cities and the like. And not to sidetrack completely, but part of the reason why apartheids are so successful, and I hate to say the word successful here, because they are traumatic and they separate, intentionally segregate and separate groups of people. Um, but the reason why they're so successful is because within an apartheid, you tend to see groups of people by their races blame other groups of people and not really blame the governmental process that is putting in laws that separate them. And so that's why you see something like apartheid stay for a very, very long time, before it eventually devolves or dissolves. So, continuing this discussion, Black political groups vocalize their opposition through violence, strikes, and demonstrations. Most foreign governments denounced apartheid as a violation of human rights. And then 1985, the US and Great Britain placed sanctions against South Africa, further placing pressure to end the policy. So, getting into some famous figures during this time, I hope I am saying his name correctly, but Bantu Stephen Biko, again, if I'm saying that incorrectly, I apologize, is famous for the Black is Beautiful quote. He was a student leader who created the Black consciousness movement, which was kind of the start to the protests and rise against apartheid during this time. And then he was taken into police custody after a protest, interrogated, and then beaten for 22 hours. He was later pronounced dead. It's just a brutal um, sort of part of history, but it's again very, very important to note that part of history. Um, And then you have Nelson Mandela, who I most people know about. He served 27 years in jail for conspiracy to overthrow the government. And then he became the president of African National Congress and served in that role from 1991 to 1997. And then he was later elected president of South Africa during its first election where all people were allowed to vote. And that's also important to note about apartheids and something as demonstrably controlling as apartheids is that only certain people were allowed to vote. Other people were excluded from that right intentionally. Um, and so he won and he served as the elected president of South Africa from 1994 to 1999. Another important term to note about is bonded labor. This is also known as indentured service. It is a contractual system in which someone sells his or her body, or their body, for a specified period of time in an arrangement very close to slavery, except it's entered into voluntarily. Now, the issue that I find with this definition, even though I included it in the slides, is that bonded labor, to fully understand it, is that it's not entirely volun, voluntary here. And I think that's important to note. Um, I find issue with the use of voluntary here or consent, because when you're stuck in a situation where you cannot get out of, right? Like being trafficked. That's something that isn't voluntary. They aren't volunteering or consenting to that. They need to do that in order to survive within their given environment. Making this definition kind of wrong here, in my assessment, in my personal assessment. So keep that in mind looking at certain definitions like bonded labor. Okay, so we're getting into, again, theorists, classical theorists like Karl Marx. So, according to Karl Marx, the means of productions are the tools, factories, and land and investment capital used to produce wealth. He again, I already lectured on this, but he splits the class system up into two categories. You have the bourgeoisie, bougie, to remember them, the capitalists here, and the proletariats or the workers. The bourgeoisie, according to Karl Marx, owns the means of productions, and the proletariats or workers make the means of productions, but are never able to own it. Um, Furthermore, according to Karl Marx, he defines and establishes a term called class consciousness. This is a shared identity based on the worker's relationship to the means of productions. When the workers believe that they are capitalists, they have a false class consciousness because they are falsely assuming that they own the means of productions when they actually don't. Class consciousness is the process where the workers start to realize that their relationship to the means of productions is flawed, that they don't actually own it. And the person who owns it doesn't actually produce the means. I hope that makes sense. He's again describing a relationship here and a conflict here between bourgeoisie and proletariats, which might, if you have a class consciousness, might lead to an instance of protests and revolts, and the establishment of unions because we saw that during his time, during Karl Marx's time. And so, being an owner or a worker is distinguished here for Karl Marx. And there's a line here that he draws in what makes you an owner of the means of production and what makes you a worker for it. Max Weber draws a lot of his research from Karl Marx, but he kind of disagrees with Karl Marx. And this is one of the points where he disagrees slightly with Marx's assessment. According to Max Weber, social class is made up of three components. This is where we get the three P's: property, power, and prestige. Um, for for Max Weber, he doesn't necessarily agree that there are just bourgeoisie, capitalists here, and proletariats, because in his writings, he describes a certain level to capitalists, that not every capitalist will own the means of production. For example, you have a manager at a McDonald's, but that manager at a McDonald's, yeah, they are capitalist here, but they don't necessarily own the McDonald's because a McDonald's is a chain, right? It's not owned by that singular manager in that given city. That's an example here, where sometimes you get capitalists who don't own all of the means of production. That's what Max Weber is getting at with property, power, and prestige, that there are different levels to it. And so there's even a layering process that is done with capitalists. So property here is also referred to as wealth. Weber makes a point in a lot of his writings that managers of corporations control the means of productions, but don't necessarily own it, like the example that I gave with McDonald's. Power involves the ability to control others. When you have a certain level of power, you are able to control others. By being a capitalist, right, you are able to control others and hold employees and establish what they do, what they wear, and the like there. Prestige can turn into power. And prestige here, for example, is maybe you are a daughter or son of a wealthy businessman, right? That would be prestige. Prestige doesn't necessarily determine whether or not you will hold power. It's how you utilize your prestige that eventually will lead to power and property. It's important to note that as well. Just wondering how much, because maybe I might just cut this off short and make a second video. I don't think so. Okay, so of course, functionalists viewed stratification a specific way, the same with conflict theorists. For Davis and Morse, they were both functionalists. They viewed stratification as inevitable. So, for society to function for them, its positions must be filled. Essentially, meaning that we kind of have to have people who work the lower paying jobs. That just has to be the case because we need that job to be fulfilled, right? And so we need the plumber, we need the McDonald's worker, we need uh, grocery store workers, right? To fill that specific role. Second point that they make is some positions are more important than others. And that's just something that they just come to a conclusion about. That, there are certain positions that it makes sense to value them more and thus pay those people more money, according to them. Third to note is the more important positions must be filled by the more qualified people. Um, they also land on this interesting point, which I don't necessarily agree that every important position is filled by the most qualified people, but I digress. Last to note is to motivate the more qualified people to fill these positions, they must offer greater rewards. Thus, getting a sort of stratification of even income and what you make, and a layering process and how we establish certain people to make a certain amount of money. So take a second, chew on this assessment, right, of stratification, think about it, and kind of take a second to reflect upon it. Does it make sense? Do you agree with this assessment? Do you not agree with this assessment? Why or why not? So, to get further into this, for functionalists, they view stratification as serving a purpose in society. This might be reminiscent of one of your readings because it is very reminiscent of a functionalist thought process. Then you have conflict theory. It is a multidimensional approach that includes class, status, and power. It also emphasizes the role of the social prestige and establishes a conflict between those who have prestige and power and property and those who do not have as much as that. Mosca's view, he's a conflict theorist, is that every society will be stratified by power. He focuses a lot on power here because no society can exist unless it is organized. And one of the ways that you can organize a society is through power. Who holds the most power and who doesn't hold the most power. This requires leadership to coordinate people's actions because we tend to see societies where an established leader is made. Leadership requires inequalities of power, and it's something that he kind of notes here that with a leader, you will get an unequal distribution of power no matter what. By definition, some people will lead and some people will follow. And then last to note is because human nature is self-centered, people in power will use their positions to seize greater rewards for themselves. Then you have Linsky's synthesis. Neither functionalist or conflict theorist. He focuses on surplus as a key to understanding stratification here. And so he said that the functionalists are right when it comes to groups, but uh, don't recognize the importance of surplus here, such as hunting or gathering societies. It becomes a different story with societies that accumulate surpluses. And then groups start um, fighting over surplus. Whoever wins becomes elite, according to Linsky. And so take a second, think about it. Think about each theorist here. Think about Linsky, think about Mosca, think about Davis and Moore. And which theory or theorists do you find most convincing on explaining social stratifications? Why and why not? What are some of your own theories about social stratification? And where might you differ in these theorists' understandings of social stratification? I personally, so take a second, write it down. I personally like Linsky's um, because he is pretty accurate here in his assessment. Um, so something to think about is that I pulled this quote. The 85 richest people in the world own as much as the world's wealth as the bottom half of the entire world's population. This is kind of getting at certain glaring statistics that get at the distribution of wealth and the unequal distribution of wealth that is especially seen in the United States. If you look to the left here or the right here, at this right here, you should see my mouse. The wealthiest 10% of the adults worldwide own 86% of Earth's wealth. The wealthiest 1% of the adults worldwide own 46% of the Earth's wealth. And so what we're seeing here and what's being highlighted is a glaring statistics, is the aspect of the unequal distribution of wealth. And so a lot of conflict theorists especially note this when they are talking about social stratification and wealth in certain nations and countries like the United States. Um, I'll briefly go over social mobility because it's something that is pretty easy to understand, because you can easily visualize it with your own life experience. But with social mobility, you tend to see upward, downward mobility. One of the things that is also key here is intergenerational mobility, how a family can change their social class from one generation to the other. So you might have the instance where a family might go from lower class to middle class because the parents' kids are able to get an education and thus make more money, right? Or you might have structural mobility, the movement up or down on a social ladder due to structural changes within society. Structural changes here would be, for example, the removal of slavery. Because slavery were keeping people from earning an honest living and keeping their property and power. And so by removing slavery and making it illegal, you have people who are now able to work for a wage and they are able to live where they want to live, right? And so that's an example of structural mobility. Another example is the aspect of women being able to work as seen during the 1950s, 1960s, right? And entering the workforce. And that kind of changed a lot of things within the workforce environment. That's another structural mobility there. Then you have exchange mobility, a number of people moving up the social ladder while a large group moves down as they are exchanged places. They might exchange places in this regard. And then you see upward and downward mobility that connects to education, family background, economic conditions, and the like. There's also barriers to mobility here in terms of discrimination, lack of opportunities, and structural inequalities. And so structural inequalities being um, again, segregation, right, would be a structural inequality. Segregating workplaces and segregating and establishing that only specific people of a race can work a specific job, right? That would be a structural inequality within a country or society. Same with establishing that only a specific gender can work a specific job or do a specific thing. That would be also structural inequality there. And it also would be a form of lack of opportunities and discrimination. And so this is a visual of the US social class ladder, showing it gets more specific, right? It's not just upper, lower, and middle class here, because it has capitalist, upper middle, lower middle, working poor, and underclass. And it further shows education that is commonly seen among capitalists, education that is commonly seen among lower middle class people, as well as working class people and working poor class people. And so when we see people who are capitalist, upper middle, lower middle, they tend to have prestigious degrees from prestigious universities. Um, Not prestigious degrees, degrees from prestigious universities, or college degrees, or a high school diploma, and the like if it's lower middle. When it gets to working, it's usually a high school diploma or some high school. And then it shows the occupations because occupations are still pretty segregated when it comes to social classes. Even in the United States, we tend to see occupations still being segregated in this way, where capitalists tend to be investors, heirs, and executives. Working class people tend to be factory workers, low paid retail sales people, and craftspeople. Um, Underclass people tend to be unemployed or part-time workers, or on welfare. Okay, where am I at with time? How much time do I have? Okay, I think I'm gonna stop here and then I'm gonna make a second part to this to kind of break it up because it's a lot of information. I prefer to break it up into two parts because this is a big, chunky slide presentation. So I will post this and then I'll get to that uh, second part. Bye.